Perfect. Perfect. So now we can start. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us today. So this is the second webinar of 2022. We are super excited about it because it's in a very special occasion, and we have two very special guests with us today. First, in terms of housekeeping, please turn off your mic. Perfect. Thank you very much. Let's try to keep the mics off. So as I was saying, we have two very special guests today, and I'm very thankful for both of you to accept our invitation to be speakers in this session. As you already see, the session is being recorded because this cycle of webinars is part of a Jamonet module, which me and Professor Francisco Pereira Coutinho are in charge of at Nova School of Law. And today with us, we have two guests, as I was mentioning. Alisa has been with us before. She included, before the pandemic, she was at Nova School of Law. And thanks, Alisa, for accepting the invitation to be once again speaking about the GDPR and all the developments since the GDPR was adopted. So just to give a very brief introduction of Alisa. So Alisa is a member of the International Data Flows and Protection Unit of the European Commission. She acted as co-lead on the modernization of the standard contractual clauses and the adequacy talks with South Korea. And she's also a member of the negotiation team on EU-US data flows. And prior to joining the European Commission, Alisa worked for the EU Delegation to the Council of Europe, while she followed the negotiations on the Modernized Council of Europe Convention 108. Secondly, we also have O with us today. Thank you very much, O, for accepting the invitation to be a speaker today. O is a legal and policy officer in the Data Protection Unit of the European Commission's Director General for Justice and Consumers. And before joining the Commission, O worked as a legal officer in the Supervision and Enforcement units of the European Data Protection Supervisor. So as you can see, we have two amazing guest speakers today, and I'm pretty sure that the conversation will be very interesting. The objective is to do kind of a balance of the GDPR in the last 4 years and also look to the future. What are the prospects? And without further ado, I would pass the floor to O to start his presentation. Once again, thank you very, very much for being here today. O? You're on mute.
Yes, sorry, because I lost your sound in the worst possible moment for this. Yes, indeed, happy to be here. And indeed, it's a special day on the fourth, well, not birthday, but the 4th year of, let's say, GDPR, then working and actually applying. So I'll do a bit of the general presentation on GDPR, where we are now and what the next steps are for that text in terms of review and the like. Then I'll link that or also discuss a bit some of the other proposals that are now in the legislative process to show a bit how they interact with GDPR, because there's been a whole lot of things coming out of the Commission as well as follow-up of the data strategy. And then Alisa for the international transfer aspect. Sorry if I'm now just repeating what you said before when your sound cut out for me, but that's what's happening now. And I will then, just 1 second, start to share some slides just to also guide me along through the presentation now. Why is okay? So indeed, when GDPR became applicable 4 years ago, there was quite a lot of talk on how this is a real game changer and completely changed the landscape. On the one hand, it's true that moving from a directive with a partially differing transposition in the member states to a directly applicable regulation, and also a regulation that has a quite strong enforcement tools, that was in that sense definitely a change. But on the other hand, the text on GDPR is really not a revolution, it's an evolution of earlier principles dating back to the former Data Protection Directive, and some of them even all the way back to the Council of Europe Convention 108. So many of the things that people claim are new are actually not new. Well, there's no need to repeat in general what it's about. It's about protecting dignity and autonomy of individuals, but at the same time also ensuring that fair, I think. So GDPR have a good reason for what they're doing, and do it securely. Now, on GDPR itself, the Commission has issued the 24. The general conclusion in the 2020 evaluation was that the system works and that the text would not be reopened. And we also don't plan to reopen it now. The reason was that, out of the criticism that maybe sometimes were uttered in civil society, also coming from industry at the time, was that the enforcement mechanism was a bit slow to start up. But in the time since then, we have seen a big pickup of activity in the EDPB, in the consistency mechanism. We've seen several high-profile decisions being issued with large fines. So there we can see that the process, or the consistency mechanism, maybe took a while to get started, but now it's working better than before. That was one of the findings that we had in that evaluation report, and we invited the EDPB to work on streamlining its procedures and becoming a bit more nimble. And indeed, they have worked on that, and there is definitely an improvement in that sense. So that is why we also right now don't plan to reopen the text. We have also called on EDPB to further clarify some concepts with additional guidelines that will help controllers comply in a better or more efficient way. So really on the GDPR itself, the message so far is that it's working, the principles are sound, we're not going to reopen it now. We'll see for the next evaluation in 2024. So that on GDPR itself. On a number of other proposals that came out, mostly as follow-up data strategy and the digital single market package, we've had and now there's going to be a lot of acronyms in the coming slides, DSA and DMA, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act. Also relevance for data, but coming at it from a slightly different perspective. Both proposals were published in late 2020. We had a political agreement among Parliament and Council this spring. So now they're in the stage of doing the final technical cleanup of the text, the lawyer linguists going through it and making sure that everything is fine for formal adoption and then publication in the OJ. What do those two texts do in the perspective of linking with a GDPR? Both of them follow kind of in what is there called an asymmetric approach. So different whom they're addressed to. In the DSA, the term VLOPs, very large online platforms, while in the which would then have some additional obligations. In the DMA, it's mostly about these gatekeepers, so the GAFAMs and some other in this world. So on the DSA, what's relevant there are the rules on notice and action mechanism to flag content, including illegal, then the associated procedures on moving that content to the associated appeals procedure on other to further these platforms impact on, let's say, society as a whole. Also, on platforms. As said, there broadly the text is political agreement reached. Now they are format of application.
I think we are experiencing trouble with the connection. And I think it's not just on my side. Maybe if you could try to turn off your camera to see if it's better.
Yep. Just wait up. Wait one. So camera off. Hope it's getting better now.
I think it is, at least for now.
Okay, good. Okay. Hope so. Normally this is stable here, but yes, always instability, always at the worst moment. In the DMA, we have rules against self-preferencing by these gatekeepers. So if somebody, and I don't want to say the big company that shares a name with a river, but somebody offers both a marketplace and is active on that marketplace, there are certain rules against self-preferencing, such as putting your own products up in the search results higher up than where they would organically end up. In posting against gatekeepers linking person data of users across services to safeguard a bit against them using their position in one market to spill over into other markets. On the other side, let's say in an opposite direction, then stopping linking data. There are rules on interoperability and access to information for business users, so that, for example, a trader on that unnamed company's big platform would obtain or can obtain additional information about user interactions that the users have with the business user on that platform, basically putting them on an equal footing with Amazon's and the like of the world on the platform, or put similarly giving them the same insight into their customers as if they shop. Those are the first two. They are really in the last stages now, and about the part, it's not a matter of days, but it's soon. Then on published spring, there it's still a bit earlier in the legislative procedure. We're now at the stage where Parliament and Council each come up with their own positions. Once they adopt them, they will then start negotiating among each other to come to the final agreement. It's just in Parliament, its deadline for amendments to the draft report is next week in some of the committees. Now, in some ways, the AI Act takes inspiration from GDPR, following a kind of a risk-based approach, depending on what kind of, for certain AI systems, it either includes a complete prohibition, or for those that are classified as high risk would, for example, be AI systems to be used in hiring employees. For that, these systems will have some additional transparency obligations to make sure that people can understand how the decisions came about, and that there are the appropriate safeguards in place. There's another interesting thing with a very direct link to GDPR, the so-called regulatory sandbox. One of the issues is, of course, that an AI system is often only as good and as representative in how it deals with different inputs as its training data. And there, these regulatory sandboxes for certain AI systems provide a legal basis for the use of personal data in their development. So there we have a link of developing. Then Data Act. This is getting now closer and closer to the present day in terms of publication. That proposal was published in February, earlier this year. It has several aspects which can be described as, it's a bit of a Christmas tree. It could have been 3 different regulations, but it's packaged in one. What are those 3 parts about? One is improved access to and sharing of IoT generated data, so building in a way on GDPR access and portability rights, but improving them in some ways, for example, that you would be able to share certain IoT generated data, whether personal or not. This is also, it's a broader text, so it could also be about sharing some mission with an external service provider for predictive maintenance. And doing so, if you remember, portability in GDPR is sometimes an issue, that because GDPR portability is rather framed as I am going from one provider, taking my data and moving it to the other, while here in Data Act, the perspective is more of, well, I stay with the initial provider, but I also share the data generated from me using that product with a third party, again, of my choosing, so that that third party can deliver an additional service to me using that data. So it's a slightly different perspective where this comes from. Then the second part of the Data Act is certain contractual requirements for B2B sharing of data, including also, well, not distinguishing between personal and non-personal. Of course, in this B2B sharing, if two businesses want to share personal data, they need to have a legal basis under GDPR for that. And in this B2B sharing scenario, it's not the Data Act that then Data Act is about, if you have established that you can do this, then here are certain ways how to do that. And it's largely about fairness in this B2B sharing. Finally, it has some rules on business to government sharing. So exceptional access by public authorities to data held by private entities, for example, to reply to emergency situations or natural disasters if there is no other already established basis for accessing the data available. Then, and now we're really getting to hot off the press, published just 3 weeks ago, the European Health Data Space proposal, which again does here basically two things in one. On what is in lingo then called primary use of data, so use of data for delivering medical treatment and also managing then the associated medicine. There it proposes, the Commission proposes additional measures to give patients better access and better access to and better control over their own health data, for example, held by a hospital, by making sure that data are immediately accessible. So you remember, in GDPR, if you launch a data subject access request, the controller has a certain amount of time to react to that. While here, for health data held by entities that will be subject to those obligations, such as hospitals, it would have to be via some portal or interface where you can get direct access, where you can see who has consulted your data, where you can give your agreement to share the data, for example, with a new specialist that you're seeing. So that is meant to streamline both the patient experience there and also limit things like repetition of running tests. That is one angle there. The other angle is secondary use of data, so improved access to health data for research and regulatory purposes, where it proposes an architecture of health data access bodies in the member states that will be newly, some member states already have them, but those that don't will then need to set them up, which will be public bodies that basically keep an catalog of electronic health data that is available for such reuse, for example, for research purposes, and which will provide a secure processing environment in which reusers, or researchers, developers would then access can access the data, for example, for medical research. What is important to note in that part is that unlike what I said earlier, for example, on data accuracy, this does not create an obligation. The health data space will create an obligation for certain data holders to make information available to these health data access bodies so that they can make them available for reuse. And second part, on the safeguard side, making available for reuse does not mean that we will share. Okay, that was just that. We will share personal data, including health data, with just anyone. No, that's not what's happening, because what the architecture is that in these secure processing environments run by the health data access bodies, the researchers can run the analysis on there, but anything that would go back out to them should only be anonymous data. So there would be no disclosure of health data to the researchers out. It would be staying in that secure environment, and then analysis would be run on it there. Third part of it is certification for electronic health record systems. It interacts a bit with the primary use part, because that's of course where large parts of these data that will be in scope will be. That proposal was just published 3 weeks ago, so there is not much yet in terms of work been done in Parliament and councils. So from Parliament, there was MPs who made first public statements what they think of the proposal. In the council, where we've done, the commission has done first presentations on kind of working group level, but it is all still very much in early stages, this proposal, which, yeah, as I said, builds a bit on access and portability rights, and on the other side, aims to increase the availability of health data for research purposes. So that is it for me. Kind of a quick overview on certain linked proposals that also have an impact on how personal data are processed in the Union. And on that, I'm sorry, I already ran a bit over time, so I end here and hand over to Alisa for international aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Shall I continue, Professor, or do you want to?
Yes, please, Alisa, go ahead. Thank you very much.
Okay. No, thank you, and very nice to be here again this year. So Owe gave you a bit of an overview of indeed what's been happening in the EU when it comes to the GDPR, but also all these other data initiatives that, of course, are in one way or another linked. I'm going to speak more about the international aspects. So what the Commission is doing, what our strategy is when it comes to international transfers of personal data, which is, of course, another important aspect of data processing in the EU. I think what we've seen, especially in the last years, is that data flows and international transfers of data are really an essential part of so many activities, from trade to cooperation between public authorities and just social interaction. And that, of course, also raises the question of how you can actually effectively protect a fundamental right, in this case, the right to data protection, in a world that has become essentially borderless. And of course, all the protections that we have in place in Europe would, in a way, become meaningless if they would just stop whenever the data leaves the EU. That's why, from our perspective, and this is the approach under the GDPR, and that's also the strategy that we as the Commission follow, is the idea is that the protection should, as much as possible, travel with the data. So the idea is not that data should stay within Europe, but that whenever it leaves the European Union, it should remain subject to a high level of protection. And under the GDPR, we have different tools to ensure this. In the Commission, we're very active in further developing these tools so that we can have data flows on this basis. So one of the tools that is provided by the GDPR is, of course, a so-called adequacy decision. And we still think that this is the most comprehensive tool, because once the Commission adopts an adequacy finding, personal data can flow freely to the third country that had received the decision. In a way, it's actually assimilated to a transfer within the European Union. And after the GDPR entered into force, we first worked with Japan, with whom we have a mutual adequacy decision that actually created the world's largest area of free and safe data flows. Since then, we continued to engage with other partners. So, for example, last year, we adopted 2 additional adequacy decisions, one for the United Kingdom and one for South Korea. And at the moment, we are in adequacy negotiations with several other countries, both in Asia and in Latin America. And perhaps a new development, and this is something quite recent, is that we've also started to explore whether we could have adequacy findings for international organizations. This is something that is possible under the GDPR for the first time, and this was not the case under the previous directive. And now in the last months, we've seen that there are actually some international organizations that are interested in this, and we're working with them to see how this could work, because of course it does require thinking a bit more or adapting the adequacy standards to the situation of an international organization, which is established under international law and functions very differently from another country. Another one of our work streams is that we're also looking at the existing adequacy decisions. So all the adequacy decisions that were adopted before the GDPR, and there are 11 of these decisions, we are required under the GDPR to review them to see whether they continue to meet the adequacy standard. And this is about decisions like the ones for Switzerland, Canada, New Zealand, Argentina, and so on. And so just to clarify this process, this evaluation, it's not about adopting new adequacy decisions, but looking at the developments in these countries since the adequacy decision was adopted. And in some cases, this goes back quite some time. I think some of the oldest decisions are more than 20 years old. So we're looking at everything that has changed in these systems, how they have evolved, whether there have been data protection reforms and so on. And we're checking this now against the new standard that we have under the GDPR, which of course has also evolved, including under the case law of the Court of Justice. And this review of the existing adequacy decisions, it's something that we had to do already in 2020 when there was the first review of the GDPR as a whole, as was also mentioned by Owe. But because we knew at the time that the Schrems II judgment was coming, we had to postpone the conclusion of this aspect of the review. And since the judgment, which of course provided additional clarifications on the adequacy standard, we actually had to engage again with all of these countries to ask additional questions, obtain additional clarifications on aspects relating to national security and criminal law enforcement. And that has taken a bit more time, but now we aim to finalize this work still this year and publish our report, which will be a report to the European Parliament and the Council. And that will essentially be a report in which we conclude for each of these countries whether or not they continue to meet the adequacy standards, so whether we keep the decision in place. And there will also be a detailed assessment of the situation in each of these countries and how it has evolved. Another important aspect of our work at the moment is, as was already mentioned before in the introduction by Graça, is the work with the US on a successor arrangement to the Privacy Shield. As you all know, in 2020, the Court of Justice invalidated the Privacy Shield because it concluded that different aspects of the US legal system in the area of national security did not meet the adequacy standard. And since then, we of course immediately engaged with the US and started to negotiate on a possible new framework. And in March this year, there was an announcement that the EU and the US reached an agreement in principle on a new framework. This essentially means that there is a political agreement, so an agreement on the main elements of a new framework. But actually, a lot of work is still ongoing at the moment, because now we need to finalize the details with the US, and then we need to translate them into concrete legal texts. So what's happening at the moment is that the US government is developing legal instrument. So there will be a new executive order that will be adopted by the president. That's essentially, it's not legislation that will go through Congress. It will be an instrument from the executive. And that will be complemented by implementing regulations that will be, for example, adopted by the Department of Justice in the US. And when these drafts will be ready of these texts, we will still have to probably further discuss this with the US to make sure that, you know, this fully reflects what we have agreed. And also, of course, from our perspective, we want to make sure that what's in these texts, that this is solid enough for the Commission to be able to propose an adequacy decision, because that will then be the next step. This new arrangement will again take the form of an adequacy decision, just like it was the case for the Privacy Shield. And on our side, to adopt an adequacy decision, we actually have to go through different steps. So first, we will propose a draft decision that will be made public. Then we will have to obtain an opinion from the data protection authorities, from the EDPB. We will also need to obtain the green light from all the EU member states. And then there's, of course, also the Parliament, that the European Parliament, it doesn't have a formal role in this process, but we know that, you know, it has been very attentive to these topics in the past, and they also have a right of scrutiny and can intervene if they think that the Commission, for example, exceeded its competence, and can even ask the Commission to withdraw or to amend the adequacy decision. You know, with these different steps that we have to go through, it's actually very difficult to give a concrete timeline, because I know that everyone is wondering how long will this take. So it's difficult to say, but based on our previous experience with adequacy decisions, usually it takes about 6 months from the moment that we present a draft adequacy decision until its final adoption. So with that in mind, and the fact that we still have to do some work with the US, we're thinking that at the very earliest, we could adopt this new framework by the end of the year or the beginning of next year. And then something that may be of interest to you as well. So everything that we have been negotiating with the US, the focus has been on national security. So on the one hand, under which conditions and in which circumstances the US intelligence agencies can have access to data once it has been transferred to the US. And on the other hand, what the available redress mechanisms are. So how individuals, to which body individuals can turn to lodge a complaint and to have that complaint resolved if they think, for instance, that their data was collected unlawfully for national security purposes. And everything that we have agreed with the US, this will be part of this new framework, let's say the Privacy Shield 2.0, but it will also apply to any other transfer tool. So if a company uses standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules, these safeguards that we have negotiated with the US will also apply to those tools. And that will, of course, have a big impact on, for example, what is called now the transfer impact assessments that companies have to do after the Schrems II judgment, because for transfers to the US, they will then be able to point to these safeguards, and the assessment will, of course, let's say in most cases then be positive. So I think, you know, having these additional safeguards in place, having this agreed with the US, will also facilitate the use of other transfer instruments. And that brings me actually to a last work stream that I wanted to mention, and that's the work on standard contractual clauses. And these are, we know it has been, you know, they have been around for more than 20 years, and this is actually the tool that is used the most by European companies. I mean, there's certain figures saying that it's about 85% or so of European companies that transfer data, that they're using SCCs for that. So last year we issued modernized SCCs, and this is something that we had been working on for a while, because we wanted to make sure that they were adapted to the GDPR, that they also you know, worked better in a modern digital economy. For example, we made them broader in the sense that they can now be used for additional transfer scenarios, for like transfers from a processor to a sub-processor, which is something which was not possible before the GDPR. We also made them more flexible, for example, by making it possible for more than 2 parties to join the contract and have additional parties joining throughout the life cycle of the contract. And of course, a big part of this modernization was also trying to, as much as possible, incorporate the clarifications that the Court of Justice provided in the Schrems II judgment. And we know that companies were struggling with this, and we wanted to help them by providing, a methodology, a toolbox of how to do the assessment and what type of safeguards they could put in place. So these are all things that we have incorporated in these new SECs. So while we were working on this modernization, we actually were working very closely with companies, civil society, so with stakeholders in general, because we wanted to make sure that we produce something that is actually helpful and practical. And since we adopted the new SECs, and that was in June last year, we continued to do this, but this time to produce guidance. So we have been in the past months collecting feedback from companies, law firms, academics, and so on their experience, their first experience with these new SECs. And actually today, we published a Q&A document on the new SECs that provides guidance. So it basically answers the most common questions that we have seen about the implementation of the SEC. So it goes from very general questions like in which scenarios can you use the SECs, how do you incorporate them in a broader commercial contract, and so on, to very specific questions like, can you have a clause that limiting liability, or what rights do individuals have and how can they exercise them? So these type of questions. And we try to be as practical as possible, for example, by also having concrete examples. But the idea is that this will really be a living document. So if you have further ideas, or if there's still things that are not clear from reading the SECs or from using them, then feel free also to pass that on to us, because the idea is that we will continue to update this document as new questions arise. A last comment I want to make on the SECs, and then I will stop, is that what we've seen in the last years, and I think that's a very interesting development that is probably only going to increase now in the coming months and years, is that there's a number of other countries and regions around the world that are using or starting to develop very similar tools. So, for example, we have seen that there are certain countries like the United Kingdom and Switzerland that have actually taken the SECs from Europe, and they've just adapted them to their legal framework, but they're essentially using the same type of instrument. And then there's several other countries like New Zealand, Argentina, and also regional organizations, for example, in Asia and in Latin America, that have developed their own model contracts that are very similar to what we have under the GDPR. And I think it's a very interesting development, because you see that different countries, regions in the world are looking at these things from a similar perspective and are developing similar tools to address these issues. And we also see this very much as an opportunity to work with these countries and with these organizations to see, for example, on the ground, how these different instruments are implemented by companies, and whether there are ways to further facilitate the use of these instruments, make it easier for companies that operate in different countries and regions to transfer data on the basis of these types of instruments. So I think we've both already spoken quite some time, so I think I will stop here. I saw that there was already one question, I think, but yeah, very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much, Alisa. So as you mentioned, Alisa, there's already one question from Francisco. So Francisco is asking, why did the EC include the short sunset clauses in the UK adequacy decision? Will this be an option for other adequacy decisions under review or new? Maybe if you could start by addressing this point, and then we can move on to other questions if there are any.
Yeah, sure. So first, of course, for any adequacy decision, there is an obligation for the Commission to review it sort of on an ongoing basis. So if there are any developments, something changes, then we always have to look at this to make sure that it doesn't affect the level of protection in that country. With the UK, it's true that the approach has been a bit specific. It's the only adequacy decision where we really have a sunset clause, in the sense that I believe it's after 4 years, essentially the adequacy decision ends unless we decide to renew it. But the reason for this is because there was, of course, a very specific context with the UK. Normally, when we engage in adequacy talks with a third country, it's because we have very different systems, or not very different, but there are certain differences between our systems, and we're trying to come closer through the adequacy process. With the UK, the situation was that they had just left the EU. They applied exactly the same rules, but there had already been some announcements from the UK government that they wanted to move away from this, that they wanted to reform their rules and to have a different approach than what existed in the EU. So there was from the beginning already a bit this risk that the legal situation would actually change. And that was one of the reasons, or I'd say the main reason, why there was this specific approach with the UK. You know, in the adequacy decisions that we did afterwards, well, it's only been Korea, but there we do not have this type of sunset clause. I would not exclude that this will come again in certain, you know, other adequacy decisions in the future. I don't think it will become, it could be like a general mechanism that we would use, but it's not excluded that this would happen again. And I think that maybe now also we'll see also what the approach will be with the US, if there's a privacy shield successor arrangement. But it could also be that, you know, from now on, each adequacy decision will be slightly different, and the review and the monitoring mechanisms will be different and a bit more tailored to the specific context in the third country. So cannot tell you what exactly is going to, you know, what approach we're going to take in the future. I think it could be something like a sunset clause, but not necessarily.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alisa. I don't know if any of the participants wants to make a question. If that's the case, please raise your hands. But while you do not raise your hands, I do have two questions. So the first one is regarding anonymous data. I see that, for example, O mentioned that some of the other laws that are being currently discussed at EU level, they kind of rely on the concept of anonymous data, like the GDPR does. If a company uses anonymous data, the GDPR does not apply. And I'm wondering if there's a lot of academic debate about whether if it's possible to effectively anonymize data. And I see a lot of EU laws relying on this concept. Isn't this a bit dangerous? This would be my first question. My second one is about data transfers. And there's also an interesting academic debate about the global reach of EU law in terms of by the adequacy decisions kind of trying to influence what third countries do in terms of data protection. And my question would be, since this is really happening in the sense that, for example, Brazil has a data protection law very similar to the GDPR, and other countries are doing the same, I was wondering if this makes it the task to consider a country adequate easier for the European Commission, and how do you, in practice, how do you consider this when you are assessing the adequacy of a third country? Is it like a fast track, or is it also really challenging to kind of assess the adequacy of the third country?
I'll try again with the video. Maybe to take the first question. Well, so for some of those others, yes, I mean, they rely on that notion in the sense that they apply to any data, whether personal or not. For example, in data, if it's generated by IoT, an IoT device in scope, it's in, and you can, for example, share it with another service provider. So in that sense, they sidestep that issue. Now, for the definition of personal data under GDPR, well, we have the addition recited 26 also then mentioned in the case, or the means reasonably likely to be used. So while, let's say, from a technical or kind of information analytics perspective, you'd have a sliding scale of how identifiable is or something is. What happens here is that the cutoff point is set by the means reasonably likely to be used. So that does not mean that beyond that point it's completely excluded if somebody were to use unreasonable means. And in that sense, yes, that border indeed can evolve with these data of the art of analysis techniques. But it was just a need to draw a line somewhere. On clarification where the line exactly is, the EDPB is also working on guidelines on anonymization and pseudonymization. They're on the work plan for this year. Well, they've been on the work plan for 21-22, and where they are progressing. And as usual with EDPB guidelines, there will be a version for public consultation where then stakeholders can contribute and later on feed into the final version. So yeah, the publication of the consultation version that's planned for.
Thank you so much.
Year.
Thank you. Perfect.
On your second question, I think adequacy can indeed be, an incentive for countries, and we've seen this. It is indeed something that plays a role, I think, in this decision of how to shape data protection laws or how to modernize existing laws. But I also think that this trend that we're seeing of more and more countries adopting similar laws, that this is also just for various reasons. One of them is that, we're all dealing with the same challenges, how to protect individuals in a world that is becoming more and more digital. There's also questions for companies that are operating more and more across borders. And they, of course, want to, for them, it's easier to do this. If the rules are similar, it's cheaper to do this. So I think there's a lot of different elements that come into play. Of course, if a country has data protection rules that are very similar to what we have under the GDPR, it makes it easier in a way, indeed, to do an adequacy assessment. There's no such thing as a fast track. I think there's no such, we don't really have a set time frame for doing an adequacy assessment. It takes as long as we need, basically, to do it. And we need to see whether all the elements that we have to meet that are listed in the GDPR, in the guidance of the EDPB, and in the case law of the court, whether all these elements are there. We're never looking for a copy paste of the GDPR, but really whether the core elements are, exist in the legal framework of the third country. And I have to say that even if, for example, laws can be very similar, like, I don't know, the UK was of course a good example, but even South Korea, the data protection law in many aspects when it comes to the principles, the rights, the obligations for controllers or processors is very similar to what we have in the GDPR. But still, when you really start looking at a law of another country, there are notions that are interpreted slightly differently. There are certain aspects that are really linked to the, let's say, the domestic context. When you think about exceptions to individual rights, for instance, for national security purposes, reasons for criminal law enforcement, you see these differences in countries and how these things are applied. And of course, there's always this big part of government access that we have to look at, criminal law enforcement, national security, which, again, very often you see similar principles, but then when you have to look at the details, of course, it's still an entirely new assessment, that we have to do. So I think it makes every adequacy assessment complex, regardless of how close the data protection law can be. But yeah, I think this development that we're seeing, I think Brazil is a really good example. I think it's very interesting what's happening there, and we see this very much as an opportunity for closer cooperation with countries like Brazil. They're also thinking about more developed data transfer rules. We're very interested in engaging with them, for example, on these things.
Thank you, Alisa. There's another question from Martin. He says, regarding past adequacy decisions besides the US and UK, Are there any concerns over their legality due to the actions of these states, both in terms of new legislation and the actions of their secret services or non-independent supervisory authorities?
Yes, I mean, different elements on this. I think first, one thing that has made this exercise quite difficult is, as I said, some of these adequacy decisions are quite old. And the way that adequacy assessments were done at the time, sometimes 20 years ago, is very different compared to now. There was not such a developed idea of the standard that we have to apply. And before the first Schrems judgment, we didn't even know that we had to look at government access questions. So this was completely missing at the time. So now, as part of this evaluation, there's, for instance, this part on government access that we had to look at for the first time in detail. And it's like almost doing a new adequacy assessment. So of course, there were things there that we didn't necessarily know at the time. Then what we've seen on the more general aspects of the data protection frameworks is that in most of these countries, there have been reforms of the data protection rules that have strengthened the data protection regime. I'm thinking, I don't know, for example, of New Zealand, Switzerland, where there have been really comprehensive reforms that again are very much have been about coming closer to what we have under the GDPR. And that's, of course, very helpful for this adequacy review. But there are some countries with whom we had identified certain differences between our systems that we needed to address. And we have actually been working with several countries on additional safeguards to address these issues. So I cannot name the countries. You will see this in the report when it comes out. But yeah, so just like we did, for example, with Korea and Japan, where we also had to negotiate certain additional rules, we had to do it with some of or we're still discussing it with some of these countries.
Thank you very much, Alisa. I don't think that we have any more questions, or we do. Martin, once again, he's asking: Is the Commission looking into the supervisory authorities of the member states regarding concerns over their independence and/or inaction due to lack of resources? Maybe address first this one, and then maybe the second one, which is from Francisco. And Francisco is asking: the Portuguese legal order is in complete turmoil after the 2008 law on data retention has been finally revoked by the Constitutional Court. Do you think it will be feasible any legislative initiative in this domain? I don't know who wants to answer which questions. Maybe since he turned on his camera, feel free to pick which one you want to answer.
On the looking into supervisory authorities, we've had a case against Belgium, which was then resolved because some of the members which had conflict of interest that affected their independence resigned from the DPA. And we have also just brought a case against Germany, not on GDPR, but on the LED, so the corresponding text for law enforcement activities, on their powers in that field. So yes, that is something that we follow. And of course, it's clearer to bring a case on issues like a clear lack of independence or a missing powers than on other things such as funding. But yes, we do follow the situation. And on funding, let me also say this is something that we've seen all in the 2020 report, that really a big majority of DPAs has received quite significant increases in funding and staff size. So while of course there is a lot of work to be done, the resources of DPAs are increasing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Alisa, do you want to pick up on the next one?
No, I don't know whether either of us can actually answer this. I think it's it's a good question, but I don't know what you think, Goa, but
well, this is then more personal opinion now, not commission position. no, the Court of Justice has, of course, said already struck down rules on that. So it's clear that there is a very limited space in which such things could happen. On the other hand, what is also clear is that governance ministers of interior would like to see initiatives in that space, but this is really nothing more that can really be said, that there's a tension between some parts wanting it and then the limitations set by the court. And I guess we'll see that topic in court again in the future.
I think we will. And let's see what the Portuguese Parliament will come up in terms of national solution to comply with, as you mentioned, a very demanding, very small size to have something in this area. Well, thank you very much, Alisa. Thank you very much, for being with us today. It was a pleasure once again, and I think that we don't have any more questions, so we can end things here. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.